Is it rational to be afraid of monsters? This is actually a question that philosophers have wrestled with. From a logical or positivist perspective, it's clearly irrational to fear something that's not real. This is known as the paradox of fiction, that we know what we're seeing or reading isn't real, but sometimes we're afraid, tearful, happy, or surprised anyway. Philosopher Peter Lamarck argues that this tells us that we don't have to believe something to respond to it, but only think it. Entertaining the thought of something is enough to have a physiological response. Humans are an imaginative species. It's a fundamental part of how we create the future, and the stories we create, whether they're about hope or fear, can become very real. In fact, in some sense, they're the only thing that creates our future. In 1932, at his inaugural presidential address, Franklin D Roosevelt delivered the now famous lines,
"Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance."
He was elected at the height of the Great Depression, at a time when liberal democracy was being questioned across Europe and fascism was starting to take hold. Mussolini declared in 1932 that the liberal state was destined to perish. The communist Soviet Union and militarist Japan challenged the American way of life. In America, fear was everywhere. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed was a major contributing factor to the disillusionment of the masses across Europe that led to World War II. For some, understanding the crash is the holy grail of macroeconomics. Unlike 2008, the crash had no obvious cause. This itself is a terrifying thought, that something with no obvious cause could lead to the worst catastrophe the world has ever seen. What if the only cause was a story about fear? According to the efficient markets hypothesis, stock prices reflect all available information about that stock. Stock prices change in response to new information, for example, new oil reserves being found, or a company developing a new product. But for the economist John Maynard Keynes, the crash was a result of popular participation and mass ignorance that can lead to irrational and chaotic swings in prices. When crashes occur, widespread fear can lead to an abrupt selling off of stocks, whether the actual use value of the company's products change or not. In other words, fear itself, and of course other human emotions, is part of that information that determines the price. And sometimes the only thing that creates the fear is other fear. When customers got wind of the extent of the crash, phone lines became jammed and in some cases went down, completely magnifying the fear. Newspapers reported suicides, bankers jumping from buildings, heart attacks. Much of the discourse from newspapers and public figures criticised the culture of speculation, greed and gambling. Religious figures called it a sin. Even Keynes used this language. "The sins of the London Stock Exchange are less than those of Wall Street," he wrote. When fear itself becomes a phenomena, it spreads and multiplies, not unlike a virus. We can see this in the language we use to talk about it. The semantics of fears of illness and disease can easily cross over metaphorically with fears of financial crashes or fears of immigration. And when metaphors are used, the associations we make can have very real, concrete effects. Like dirty money and the addiction of greed, immigrants and the other have always been described as dirty or diseased. Likewise, communism was described during the Red Scare as infecting American society. At the time of the Depression, the fear of still relatively recently freed slaves was discussed in these kinds of terms. In 1933, there were 28 reported lynchings. The actual number was likely much, much higher. All of these phenomena, these stories, contribute to a fear that can spread across society like a dark cloud. In 1869, neurologist George Miller Beard had popularised the term neurasthenia as a disease that encompassed a loose collection of symptoms including stress, anxiety, fatigue and depression. Neurasthenia became known as the disease of middle-class white Americans. Some medical professionals and theologians argued that neurasthenia was something that couldn't neurologically affect black Americans because their inferior brains were less sensitive to all the new information white Americans were absorbing. The hypothesis was that neurasthenia was a product of a rapidly changing and more intense world, the stimuli overbearing the especially sensitive and thoughtful brain of the white man. Middle-class Americans were becoming neurotic about the world, fearful of the enemy within, of urbanization and modernization. Neurasthenia became known as Americanitis. It was the illness of fear itself. The cloud spread. Roosevelt's Fear Itself speech marked the beginning of the New Deal in America, the most dramatic reorganization of American politics in the country's history. For the first time, the government provided support for struggling farmers, the unemployed, and the elderly. In the face of encroaching fears, the New Deal changed everything. Where traditionally America had been strictly liberal, almost libertarian, the New Deal challenged the individualistic, non-interventionist philosophies the country had adopted since its birth. Furthermore, the New Deal represented a political shift that affected the entire world and defines politics in the West till this day. In the book Fear Itself, The New Deal and the Origins of Our Time, historian Ira Katznelson argues that fear was a powerful motivator, if not the powerful motivator, in passing these new policies. She argues that it was fear that motivated Congress to pass legislation that were necessary evils, or the wrong actions for the right cause. Fear of social unrest, the fear of depression, and the fear that led to it, fear of dictatorship and communism. One senator said that if this country ever needed a Mussolini, it needs one now. Southern politicians were intent on retaining the segregation between blacks and whites that was a structural feature of the social order. The fear of losing this racial superiority defined their attitudes to national politics. When negotiating the New Deal, Washington made concessions to the segregationists in the South, essentially trading the continuing of the status quo with votes to enact the deal. The Jim Crow South were, of course, pivotal to passing new legislation through the houses. Katznelson writes that the triumph, in short, cannot be severed from the sorrow. Liberal democracy prospered as a result of an accommodation with racial humiliation and its system of lawful exclusion and principled terror. I find all of this quite scary. It's clear that fear motivates the course of history as much as rational political and social deliberation. Does this mean that fear is irrational? Do we politically, economically, or socially panic irrationally about fear itself when we shouldn't? In one essay, sociologists Lee Clark and Karen Chess argue that panic is actually rare. In fires, plane crashes, natural disasters, panic explains very little. Most people actually act reasonably rationally. But some studies have also shown that we have the capacity for fear biologically wired in us at birth. In other words, we are born with an objectless fear, ready to attach experience onto it. Fear with no object is usually defined as anxiety, and like a muscle, if our capacity to fear is overused, it becomes more difficult to switch off, and in some cases can lead to conditions like PTSD. I think this has some obvious consequences. The politics of fear is something we should get used to, but that doesn't mean we can't think about it in a better way. One consequence of both our imaginations and mass media is that fear gets magnified and multiplied. Other person's fears become our own. All politics, economics, social issues, even personal decisions are partly based on fear. We might work when we don't want to because of fear of not paying rent, or we vote for better pensions because we fear of not being provided for when getting old. So it's not about overcoming fear, but maybe it's about being critical about what we should fear the most. What's a justified fear, or the most justified fear? We should think about an economy of fear. In voting, for example, weighing up our own fears with what we're told we should fear, in a way rationalizing our emotions. Fear itself is really only the other side of the coin of desire. Politically and economically, thinking about what we most want day to day can tell us exactly what we should most fear. Thank you to Aghast for providing the incredible music for this video, plus this great song you're hearing right now. Check out his SoundCloud through the link in the description below. It's really, really good. If you like these videos and want to support Then and Now, then here's my request. If you think you get as much value from 4 of these videos as you do from just 1 cup of coffee, then please consider pledging just $1 towards the creation of each new video on Patreon, where you can even limit your pledge to just $1 per month. If you subscribe below, then please make sure to hit that bell to make sure you get alerted to new videos, and you can follow me on Twitter and Facebook in the links in the description below. Thanks to all my existing Patreons, and see you next week.